October 25th, 1917. This day marked a decisive moment for Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik comrades as they seized an opportunity to bring about a profound transformation. This day witnessed the overthrow of the Provisional Russian government, paving the way for the commencement of their ambitious proletarian revolution that would reverberate throughout the vast territories of the Russian Empire. The actions taken on that historic day laid the groundwork for a new era in Russian history, driven by the ideals of the working class. Over the course of 5 years, the Bolsheviks persevered in the struggle to maintain their hold on power, amidst a rapidly shifting political landscape in Russia. It was a time of great turbulence and transformation. However, in the year 1922, a significant turning point arrived for the Bolsheviks. They emerged victorious over the Russian White Army, thereby solidifying their position and allowing them to redirect their energies towards a profound internal transformation of Russian society. Their ultimate goal was to bring about a communist utopia, a vision that drove their tireless efforts and shaped their policies aimed at reshaping the very fabric of the nation. With the defeat of their adversaries and a clearer path forward, the Bolsheviks embarked on a journey to institute profound changes that would leave an indelible mark on the destiny of Russia. For these reasons, Vladimir Lenin is today seen as a hero and venerated by communists. According to them, Lenin and the Bolsheviks managed to end decades of oppression and backwardness that was present in Russia under the Tsarist regime, and brought about a new age of prosperity and equality, where everyone was free from their shackles. Or at least, that is what communist historiography tells us. I always knew that early Soviet Russia under Lenin was definitely not on the top 10 list of most livable countries around that time, but I never realized just how bad and horrific things were until I genuinely started reading about the events that unfolded under his reign. Rather than freeing the people of Russia, Lenin brought more terror and suffering unto them than any previous Tsarist regime. In this video, I will be showing the true extent of suffering and terror that were happening under early Bolshevik Russia, and also exposing how Lenin was not this caring and benevolent father figure so many communists see him as, and I will be showing the true extent of Lenin's terror across Russia. In 1918, as a means of trying to win the Russian Civil War and solidify their control over Russia, the Bolsheviks set up a temporary political and economic system called war communism. To be fair to Lenin and the Bolsheviks, war communism, in Lenin's eyes, was only temporary until the political and military struggle was over and for the transition to real socialism would begin. However, it does not change the fact that millions of Russians suffered because of this policy, and it was especially the Russian impoverished peasants who were hit the hardest with war communism. The peasants were all obligated to meet strict quotas of their labor and hand it all over to the Bolsheviks without keeping any of their wheat, fruits, or vegetables. Even before war communism was made an official policy, in 1917, the Bolshevik secret police, the Cheka, reported more than 4,000 quote-unquote peasant disturbances, and war communism did not make the relationship between the Bolsheviks and the peasants easier, because soon after, the Cheka reported between October and November 1918 that there were 44 separate peasant uprisings. The forced food requisitions were, obviously, detested universally by every Russian peasant. The requisition levels were set by officials in Moscow across Russia, and none of them knew or even cared about the size of any local food surpluses, which led to a single-family farm being demanded much more than they were able to produce. The Bolshevik requisitioners had to arm themselves whenever they went to collect, since they found resistance practically everywhere they went. So they resolved to creating quote-unquote food armies that bludgeoned any peasant into submission, and for the Russian peasants, it was practically like a second serfdom. And the situation would get even worse, because depending on the resistance, entire villages and towns were burned and destroyed. The town of Kalinovskaya completely razed to the ground, and the whole population of 4,220 either deported or expelled. The town of Ermolovskaya, completely emptied of all 3,218 inhabitants, were also either deported or expelled. In several regions, the peasant revolt became so huge that several divisions of the Red Army had to be called to quash them, and the situation became so bad that Commander Vladimir Antonovsenko, who was in charge of crushing the partisans, openly admitted that, quote, half the peasantry was starving. In the regions around the Volga River, the situation was especially terrible, as the commander of the Volga military district reported, quote, crowds of thousands of starving peasants are besieging the barns where the food detachments have stored the grain. The army has been forced to open fire repeatedly on the enraged crowd. Initially, the Bolsheviks were struggling to fend off the peasants, but with the influx of new arms and other weapons from abroad, the rebellions were being swiftly dealt with. The Tambov Rebellion was the last major peasant uprising. In the span of 2 years, from 1920 to 1922, the Red Army suffered a humiliating loss of 237,908 soldiers to opponents who, lacking firearms, fought mostly with farm equipment. Now Lenin, finally realizing how much suffering their acquisitions were causing, repealed them in favor of mild grain taxes with a slight tolerance for a sort of grain market. But this came way too late for millions of peasants who by mid-1922 faced starvation on an unprecedented scale. But in the end, the Bolsheviks never really won over the peasants, rather they systematically bashed them into submission and starvation, who in the end were too weakened by hunger to fight. In a way, I believe war communism was also a deliberate plot by Lenin to indirectly wage a war on the Russian peasants, because Lenin, in his own words, once said that the peasants were, quote, far more dangerous than all the Denikins, Yudenichs, and Kolchaks put together, since we are dealing with a country where the proletariat represents a minority. Lenin saw the peasants as a bigger threat than the entire White Army and anti-communist resistance, and with the peasants now being forced into submission and being so weak to even fight, it would open the door for more radical changes in Russian society, which I will bring up later on. The situation was not much better in the large cities either. By 1920, Petrograd and Moscow, once the crown jewels of a mighty empire, had practically become ghost towns. The population of Petrograd before mid-1917 was around 2.5 million. In the span of 3 years, from the October Revolution until mid-1920, the population was reduced to just 750,000. Both Petrograd and Moscow had nearly run out of fuel, with entire buildings being torn down just for wood. Citizens could barely stand in line for bread, which sold on the black market for millions of rubles. Colonel Edward Ryan, an American Red Cross commissioner, was investigating the humanitarian situation of Russia, and this is what he wrote, quote, Moscow and Petrograd are indescribably filthy in outward appearance. I was told the streets had not been cleaned for more than 3 years. The dirt and rubbish is in all places at least ankle deep, and in most places it is up to one's knees. And there are many places where it is as high as one's head. And with the peasant revolts going on across the countryside, the food situation was crashing hard on these two cities. Even the privileged laborers of heavy industry, the proletariat, could not even get by, which would cost Lenin and the Bolsheviks hard. By mid-1921, only 2% of factory workers belonged to the Bolshevik Party. And then, starving workers did what starving workers did the best. They called a general strike to get their demands met. And what did the world's first proletarian government do to solve this issue with the proletariat? They responded with bullets, firing into a group of workers and killing several of them. The situation got so out of hand that Grigory Zinoviev, the party boss in Petrograd, directly warned Lenin that if he did not get reinforcements, quote, we are going to be overrun. The strikes eventually reached the Russian port city of Kronstadt, a city that provided the Bolsheviks with support ever since the October Revolution, and now they were openly rebelling. On March 8, 1921, the local newspaper in Kronstadt would hit the Bolsheviks where it hurt them the most, stating, quote, "In carrying out the October Revolution, the working class hoped to achieve its liberation. The outcome has been an even greater enslavement of human beings." Soon after, Leon Trotsky would launch an attack on Kronstadt, ending the rebellion with a massacre. In the very beginning, the Red Terror was said to have been aimed at quote-unquote class enemies, but now that terror had shifted over to starving peasants and even, ironically, the very same proletariat they claimed to be supporting. Instead of being freed from their chains, as the Bolshevik saying went, Russian urban workers would instead face the daily dread of ending up in torture chambers of the Cheka, while their peasant counterparts were being drenched with blood in the countryside, facing, as the Kronstadt newspaper stated, an even greater enslavement of human beings. By the summer of 1921, requisitions among peasants had stopped and Lenin introduced the grain tax as I previously mentioned. But even with the forceful requisition stopping, the peasants saw almost no improvement in their quality of life. The entire Volga basis was still suffering from poverty, which would last till 1922, which is known as the Povolzhye famine. Bolshevik sources indicate that 25 million people were on the brink of starvation, including 7 million children. To be completely fair to the Bolsheviks, they were not the only cause of the famine. In May and June, a terrible drought descended on all of Russia, and wheat quite literally burned as it came up from the ground, and grain reserves completely disappeared within days. However, the Bolsheviks were doing absolutely nothing to help combat the famine. The regime did spend some money on food imports, but those were primarily for the cities. Worst of all, they did not even contain any grain or seed, but luxury food. Swedish herrings, 40,000 tons, Finnish salted fish, 250 tons, German bacon, 7,000 tons, French pig fat, and even chocolate. As one of Lenin's own purchasing agents later recalled, quote, "Communist elites in Moscow and Petrograd were consuming truffles, pineapples, mandarin oranges, bananas, dried fruits, sardines, and Lord knows what else, while everywhere else in Russia, the people were dying of hunger." It really sounds like the Bolsheviks were intentionally trying to let the peasants starve into submission, since as Lenin stated, they were a huge threat to the Soviet state. And it's not just me who came to that conclusion. One Cheka agent later wrote how he genuinely believed that, quote, "The Soviet regime is trying to starve all the peasants who dare resist it." Maxim Gorky, after realizing the scale of the famine and how the state was doing nothing to help, issued an appeal to all honorable people, requesting international aid to help combat the famine. And it worked. Herbert Hoover, the head of the American Relief Administration, responded positively and established a first-class operation in Russia. Now Lenin obviously could not just bar them from entering, since even he knew that this would not look good on the international stage, so he instead put them under surveillance as counter-revolutionaries. Over the course of the operation, the ARA shipped over 2 million tons of grain and foodstuffs, enough to adequately feed 11 million people, and then, I do not kid you, the famine had virtually ceased entirely by early 1922. Only thanks to Hoover and the ARA did the famine stop entirely, and the success of the capitalistic America in feeding millions of Russians was politically embarrassing for the Bolsheviks. Now Lenin did try to fight the famine in his own way only after Gorky raised awareness of it. However, he was not exactly successful. He did establish a proletarian aid front in Berlin, which by October 1921 collected over $125,000. However, more than half of that money, $73,000 to be exact, was spent on printing new Bolshevik propaganda, not alleviating the famine. Just like with other private property, in 1918, church property was also nationalized by the Bolsheviks. However, the Bolsheviks were not making any drastic moves against religion, since the Politburo received strict orders from Lenin in 1921 that, quote, "they must give absolutely no offense to religion." Lenin obviously did not give out this order because he was genuinely trying to protect the church and being compassionate, but because, as I have stated before, he feared the Russian peasants. If the new regime started going against the church, it could provoke the rural communities greatly. But by 1922, when the vast majority of peasant revolts had been dealt with, and the peasants pretty much being unable to fight due to starvation, there was absolutely no reason for Lenin to hold back against the Russian Orthodox Church any longer, and that is what he did. With this, I would like to tell you all the story about Patriarch the Khan of Moscow. The Khan had established his own famine relief committee, trying to appeal to Russian Christians to, quote, "take the suffering into your arms with all haste, with hearts full of love and a desire to save your starving brothers." Since the establishment of the committee, the Khan managed to collect over 9 million rubles. The Patriarch would then write to Lenin, asking permission for the church to be allowed to buy food supplies directly and organize relief kitchens in famine areas. Now, let's play a little game called How Did Lenin Respond? Did he A. thank Father the Khan and give him his full support for the Famine Relief Committee, or B. order the committee dissolved, its leaders arrested and exiled, and place Father the Khan under house arrest? Do I even have to tell you how he responded at this point? Patriarch the Khan was placed under house arrest in Moscow. Although he still continued receiving donations, he was ordered to hand over all his earnings to the government who, surprise surprise, did not spend any of it on famine relief. Around this time, the Soviet regime was completely running out of money, and they had to squeeze out every last cent. Leon Trotsky, however, would get a brilliant idea on how they could make more money for the state. The plan was simple. Trotsky would get to take over as head of a new commission overseeing famine relief. They would accuse the Orthodox Church of hoarding money and not caring for the starving peasants, convince and lie to people that they should storm churches and cathedrals, taking all the valuables, tell them that the money would go towards famine relief. In reality, all the acquired wealth would be given to the state. It was the perfect crime. Keep in mind, Hoover and the ARA were handling the famine extremely well all on their own, so the Bolsheviks pretended to be helping just so they could accumulate more money for the government. Trotsky would proceed to instruct the press to write articles such as these, quote, "Why were the clergymen not using their gold and silver valuables to buy grain which could save several million of the hungry from starvation?" Oh, the irony. Also falling in line with Trotsky's plan, Herbert Hoover would inform US President Warren Harding how by February 1922, the Bolsheviks were actually ordering him to slow down the food shipments, restarting the famine in some areas, just so that it could neatly fit in with the plan. With the plan now in action, hundreds of thousands of peasants and Red Army soldiers would storm churches and monasteries across Russia, looting and plundering all the valuables they could find. But the plundering wasn't just motivated by money, but also by the state atheism of the country. Bolsheviks would open and expose the tombs of numerous saints, and Lenin would also personally order the famous Troitsky-Sergievskaya monastery to be turned into a museum of atheism. One of the most notorious events that took place was in the town of Shuya, where crowds of worshippers gathered to defend their local church and managed to repel the Reds. A few days later, they returned bringing troops with machine guns who would then proceed to mow down everyone standing in their path. Trotsky would proceed to convene a Politburo meeting to discuss the Shuya incident, and what makes this meeting more notable, Vladimir Lenin himself issued a top-secret dictation from his home. and thanks to the opening of Soviet archives in 1991, Lenin's true thoughts on these situations were finally exposed. Quote, "I believe that the enemy here commits a major strategic blunder. The present moment offers us a 99% chance of overwhelming success in shattering the enemy and assuring our position for decades. It is now and only now, when in the famine regions there is cannibalism and the roads are littered with hundreds if not thousands of corpses, that we can, and therefore must, carry through the confiscation of church valuables with the most rabid and merciless energy. Without such capital, no government work is possible, no economic reconstruction, and especially no defense of our position at the upcoming Inter-Allied Debt Settlement Conference in Genoa. We absolutely must take into our hands this capital of several 100 million rubles. No other moment except that of desperate hunger will give us such a mood among the broad peasant masses, such as will assure us their neutrality." You heard it here from the man himself. Lenin did not express any sorrow for the starving peasant masses. Rather, he used their suffering as a stepping stool to raid and plunder religious buildings so that the Soviet regime could make more money. The armed robbery of Russia's churches were met with considerable popular resistance, which is exactly what Trotsky and Lenin hoped for. Over the months, thousands of priests were arrested, with over 1,500 clergymen being sentenced to death. Not only that, but Lenin specifically asked to be informed on a daily basis how many priests had been shot. Over the course of their war on the church, the Bolsheviks intentionally manipulated the people and convinced them that this money would go to famine relief, intentionally halted food shipments from the US just to make it seem more believable, and in the end used all of this money for government expenses, leaving behind a pool of blood of innocent clergymen and desecrating thousands of years of Russian history. I have seen so many communists attempting to justify almost everything I have mentioned here. They claim that the actions of war communism are completely justified in the state of a war, how there is absolutely nothing controversial or out of the ordinary in this case. But keep in mind, this system of war communism is exclusive to the Bolsheviks and communism. No other state during the First World War had to resort to these radical measures just to win a war. And the very same thing goes for Tsarist Russia and the provisional government. They never had to resort to taking away all the grain of peasants and initiating a ruthless terror across the entirety of the country. They managed to at least handle the situation well. But then when the Bolsheviks suddenly came to power, they caused the deaths of millions of Russians because of their radical shift in policies. However, one thing you absolutely cannot excuse is their blatant effort to lie to the Russian people and using the famine and all the starving men, women and children to root out resistance among the peasants and squeezing out as much money from them as possible. Practically everything Lenin and the Bolsheviks accused the old regime of doing, they carried out these actions themselves and made them worse than any regime before that. This video should also serve as a reminder that the Bolsheviks never came to power due to a massive popular support as many communists love claiming. They didn't solidify their rule through the popular masses, but the violent suppression, slaughter and starving of all the people who dared oppose them, especially the very same proletariat they claimed to be representing.